My stepmother has the largest Christmas village on the western slope of Colorado. The newspaper did a write-up on it. It's a real thing. There's actually a YouTube video you can watch, and she shows all of it. And goes pretty fast, and it takes over 6 minutes to watch. I know it's a strange time to talk about a Christmas village. It's not Advent. Instead, we are nearing the end of the season of Lent, but as I was preparing this sermon, the setting was not so much in the wilderness in my head where we've been traveling in this season with John the Baptist and with Jesus, but instead I kept going back to that Christmas village. It's a 1950s village with an ice skating rink and classic cars and happy people. There are shining lights, no noise really, but you just know that all the people that are on their way somewhere have Bing Crosby playing in their heads as they make their way down the cozy, narrow streets from the ice cream parlor to the sock hop in their poodle skirts. Of course, that's not the wilderness. Or maybe it is. Now, there are some in this room that can remember life in the 1950s. Some. There are some who can't really remember. Those memories are a little foggy. Many were not yet born, but we've heard stories. We've heard the songs and seen the movies. I question if it was really a decade that people refer to when they're talking about the 50s. Maybe it's more of a feeling, because it seems folks can attribute things to that decade that came out much later in the 60s, but they seem to fit that 50s feel. We don't want to put those in the 60s because we know in our collective narrative the turmoil in the 60s, so we just move the good stuff back a decade. We do that, not always on purpose. We are able to create what some call false memories. I read that researchers are beginning to understand that the human mind can create, exaggerate, distort, or even reinvent a memory after an event that impacted them greatly. And I have to wonder, is this true only on the individual level? Maybe we do this collectively, because as much as our memories are our own, we tend to hold narratives somewhat together. It is not just my stepmom that has this Christmas ideal of the 1950s, but there's a culture of remembering in a certain way. We share our stories and we reflect back on time periods as good or as bad based on where we are finding ourselves in a particular moment. That's what's happening in our text today. This is our 5th week journeying in the wilderness. During the season of Lent, we have stepped out of the ordinary lives we lead, on Sundays at least, to accompany Jesus in his 40 days of fasting and temptation. And much of what we have discovered in the wilderness are the things that we can be tempted with, and how Jesus always turns them on their head. When he was tempted with hunger, by eating something that wouldn't fill him, by eating stones of bread, we realize that we can't fill anything within us in that place that only God can fill. There's nothing else that can fill that. The next week, Jesus was tempted with safety, and we realized that a life of faith was never about safety, but about wholeness, which includes risk and sacrifice. And last week, Jesus was tempted with power, and we found the ultimate power, the power of God, is not the power of domination or control, but the power of vulnerability. Today, we are not with Jesus in his 40 days in the wilderness, but with the Israelites in their 40 years. They have fled Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and have been making their way on this journey through the wilderness. There was a moment back in Genesis where they started to panic because they didn't have any food. But then God provided them manna, bread from heaven for them to eat, enough for each day and for the Sabbath. Never more. There was always just enough. And it seems they've been living off of manna for a while when we meet them in our text today, because they are sick of it. It doesn't sound all that terrible in the text Judy read for us. The manna the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. I mean, it could have tasted like Brussels sprouts. But instead it tasted like cake. What are they complaining about? And yet they want something more. Now, the sermon title in your bulletin says regret. And at first I thought that they were regretting their choice, regretting this journey of stepping into the wilderness, because they cried out, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. I mean, you know how that feels. I mean, there are times like the 4th day after Thanksgiving when you just cannot eat another turkey sandwich. And so this shows us the humanity of the Israelites. It's a reminder that the wilderness is not an easy place to be, and it is not just Jesus that is called to journey in the wilderness. I wondered if they were really regretting, though, going into the wilderness. Did they really think they were better off, enslaved in Egypt, suffering and oppression? They were crying out there too. The story goes that they cried out and God heard their cries and called Moses to liberate them. But the more I read, I realized regret is the wrong word. I realized it after the bulletins were printed. Because we regret doing something we know was wrong. But they still didn't know where this path was leading. They didn't have the full knowledge if this was a mistake following Moses, or if it could potentially be the best decision they ever made. What they suffered from was not regret. It was nostalgia. It's always easier to recognize the problems before you than those behind you. And the Israelites were so sick of eating manna, so tired and weary from their journey in the wilderness, it made them long to just not be there anymore. Maybe they were remembering Egypt through false memories, or maybe it was selective remembering that led them to cry out. But it's important for us to recognize the danger of nostalgia. We usually think of it as a benign emotion that catches up with us on occasion, but I read this week that nostalgia was actually, the term was coined in the 17th century, and it was actually understood as a mental disorder, and it was to be avoided at all costs. It's challenging for us to understand because often feelings of nostalgia bring us back to places of comfort and joy from our past. But there is danger there in not remembering the whole story. That was obviously what was happening with the Israelites. They were hungry for something other than manna. And so instead of focusing on liberation, the liberation they now know in the wilderness, they are only remembering certain foods. It is a temptation, much like the temptations Jesus faced these last few weeks, to not only look back and think of what was in the past was better. I think of folks who have decided to take a risk, to step out of what is known and comfortable, and to join a church delighting in the community, only to face a challenge, as there are always challenges when people gather together and work together. Something negative can come up, and then people start to wonder and question, should I have not come? Should I have not been a part of this community? Even though their life is better, their spirit is engaged and strengthened, but it got hard, and they struggled to continue that journey. Or in spiritual practice, for those that commit to prayer or meditation, usually they do so because they want a form of transformation. They want to see the world encounter God in real and intentional ways. But when you begin to sit still, when you begin to be honest with God about who you are, it's not all sunshine and roses. To get to the place you want to be, there is usually a difficult road to travel. Meditation includes confronting fears and doubt and insecurities. Often in both situations, those that are internal and those that are external, we have to confront the reality that reality is not the same as our expectations. But often in matters of faith, reality exceeds our expectations, but it also requires more of us than we were prepared to give. It's in those moments that we confront the challenges we are facing, that we look to the past and we see, oh, that looks easier. It looks better. I don't want to keep moving forward. I just want to go back to what I know, even if it was oppressive. Because nostalgia doesn't tell the full story. We know that in our lives, and we can see that in our common life together. Wherever you fall on the political spectrum, we have to look at the chant, "Make America Great Again," and ask, for whom was it great? When was it great? Because I can look at my stepmother's Christmas village and say, oh yes, this is so nice and so good and so simple. Why can't we return to this? But then when you think about life in the 50s, it wasn't all sock hops and ice cream sundaes. I doubt I would be able to live my call to preach. Although the UCC has been ordaining women for well over 100 years, most churches would not call a woman to serve as pastor. It certainly was not ideal in the 1950s for the LGBTQ community, who lived in the shadows, and even with that faced governmental persecution as the Lavender Scare led to the firing of thousands of employees who were just suspected to be gay or lesbian. The 1950s was not ideal for African Americans who were still living under Jim Crow segregation laws. Nostalgia allows us to overlook where we are and the value of the present. The Israelites had been freed from slavery, and all they could do was complain about the food. What they failed to remember is what led them to step out in the wilderness in the first place. And for us as well, we must remember why we are in this wilderness and why we ever step out to do something besides the status quo. Because God is calling us to grow, calling us to strengthen our spirits, calling us to engage, calling us to be transformed individually and collectively. Now, it's not all good news. I have to admit that those who were in the wilderness complaining about manna, not all of them made it to the promised land. Of that 40 years, some spent their life there and never got to the place they were going. But their children did. Now that kind of work, that kind of call is not for the faint of heart. To step out of what we know into an unknown future that we might never fully realize. And yet that is the work we are called to do. To plant a tree in whose shade we might never rest. To combat the biggest issues that plague us, from climate change to racism, knowing that my efforts to compost or taking a course on white privilege will not change the systems. But we do them anyways. We do the little things and the hard things because it was each step of that 40-year journey in the wilderness, each tiny step forward with hope, not backward, but forward, that ultimately led them to the promised land. Today there is a lot of pain in our world, and today there is much to be grateful for. Today we grieve with Jackie's family, and today we rejoice with Maxine and her family. It's a sacred day for her story and for ours. But as tomorrow comes, may we not be nostalgic. May we be persistent. To live the promises that we made to Maxine this morning, to teach and to love and to live as Jesus calls us, to boldly move forward and not fall prey to temptations of the past. For our God, the God we promised to teach Maxine about, the God we sing about, our God is always making things new.